Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of First Date Unsolved. Today is Halloween. Yay! Tonight, kids all across America are going to dress up as princesses, superheroes, ghouls, and goblins before they head out with their adults in tow to collect as much candy as possible. That's the goal, right? And seeing as how candy is a major part of the Halloween tradition, I thought that it would be the perfect time to talk about Dover's chocolate candy murders. This case is very famous, actually, and there's a good chance that some of you may have already heard about this case, but I'm here for those of you who have not. This case has been solved, surprisingly, even though it took place in the 1800s, but it is an infamous part of Dover's history and a major historical event, as it was the first murder in the country to be committed by using the Postal Service. And I'm going to leave the trick-or-treating to all of you and just jump right into the story. Now, to start off, I'm going to guess that John was a popular name back in the 1800s, back long time ago, because there are two Johns in this story, and I'm going to do my best to not confuse them for you. First, we have John Brown Pennington, who was a U.S. congressman for Delaware. He was born in Newcastle. He graduated from Jefferson College in Pennsylvania and moved to Indiana for several years, where he worked as a teacher. After he returned to Delaware, he decided that he wanted to study law. He was admitted to the bar in 1857 and commenced to practice law in Dover. He was a member of the Delaware State House of Representatives in 1857, clerk of the Delaware State House of Representatives in 1859, 1863, and 1871. He was United States Attorney for the District of Delaware, 1868 through 1872, and Attorney General of Delaware State, 1874 to 1878. In 1887, he was elected as a Democrat to the 50th and 51st Congress, serving until 1891. Not a candidate for renomination, he resumed the practice of law until his death at age 76 in Dover, Delaware. That John knows his law, okay? Overachiever, for sure. This John also married a woman by the name of Rebecca Rowan, and the couple had 5 children. The youngest of those children was Mary Elizabeth Pennington. Mary is one of the victims in the story and a main character, so you'll need to remember her. Mary Elizabeth would grow up to meet and marry the other John in this story, John Preston Dunning. The couple wed on February 11th, 1891. Just a habit of saying 19, right? And the two 20-year-olds settled in Dover after their nuptials. Dunning was a gifted writer and a successful foreign correspondent. He had covered a cyclone in Samoa in 1889, where he was credited with helping pulling drowning sailors out of the surf for several hours. He also covered the Chilean Civil War the same year he got married, so covering small town happenings in Delaware was not something that was going to keep John happy. It just wasn't going to cut it. After weighing his options, Dunning decided to apply for a job that would move him and his family to the West Coast. After accepting his new position with the Associated Press, Mr. and Mrs. Dunning migrated all the way across the country with their baby girl and began their new life in San Francisco. Turns out that Mary was also a popular name because there are 2 Marys in the story, Mary Elizabeth Dunning, and their daughter was named Mary as well. I'll just call her Mary Jr., I guess. Life on the Gold Coast was decent for the first few years for the young family. I say decent and not sunshine and rainbows because Mary Elizabeth was very much a woman of faith and lived her life as such. John's view on things were much more laxed, so that did cause some friction between the two. But newlyweds, it's new. We're gonna work on things. They lived in a beautiful home at 2529 California Street, and if you Google this, it's very much like San Francisco style housing you would expect. Kind of like the opening scene of the house in Full House. However, we wouldn't be talking about these people today if the only issue in their marriage was different opinions on religion. One day in 1895, John is out and about taking a stroll, and he decides to pass through Golden Gate Park. I've always heard that the weather over there is ideal, like my kind of weather. So I'm sure Mr. Dunning was taking full advantage of the blue skies and zero humidity when his eyes landed on a woman sitting upon a bench. John was immediately intrigued, and the two instantly struck up a conversation. Initially, this woman told John that her last name was Curtis and that her husband was off in England on business. After the two had more time to become acquainted, she did eventually admit that her name was actually Cordelia Botkin. Cordelia is described as being a short and stout woman. That's how she was described. I don't know her. I wasn't around, so those aren't my words, okay? This is how everyone described her. And by society standards, she was no prize. She, in my opinion, this is my opinion, she was frumpy, and she gave off crazy Miss Trunchbull vibes. Miss Trunchbull from the Matilda movies, the mean principal. That, in my opinion, those are the vibes she gives off. But John said that it was her energy that drew him to her and not her physical appearance. I'm going to sound incredibly old and stupid right now, but Cordelia was, how these kids say, full of riz. That's what my nephew would say. She has the riz. She was confident and charismatic, and she knew it. Miss Botkin is also said to have loved to have her photo taken, and at one point she claimed she had posed for more than 100 photographs. Some of us might not think that's a big deal because I can guess there are a few of you out there who have 100 photos of yourself in your phones right now. But in the 1800s, that wasn't that wasn't common. So to have your photograph taken 100 times is astonishing, to say the least. And although she lied about her name initially, she was telling the truth about being married. But her husband, Welcome Botkin, was not across the pond in England. He was living not far away in Stockton, California. You see, Mr. and Mrs. Botkin were separated. Welcome and Cordelia decided that they had grown apart, but would remain legally married. Divorce was a thing at this time in our country, but not a common occurrence. It was actually quite difficult to get a divorce in the state of California all the way up until 1969. And I did say that right this time, 1969. So it was just easier for them to stay married but live separately, okay? Welcome was a wealthy man, and he agreed to pay his estranged wife alimony every month so that she could continue to take care of herself and their son, Beverly. Other than that, the pair didn't interact much, and Cordelia was able to do as she pleased. Cordelia and John would often talk about their spouses and even began to form a bond over how the two of them just didn't feel seen or understood by their partners. Their relationship quickly developed, and the once strangers turned into lovers. Cordelia was kind of like a guy's girl. She liked to drink, gamble, and party. She hung out at brothels and bars, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll is her motto, right? Not literally, of course, but this behavior was all new to John, and all I could think of when I hear is how they were living their lives is, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So, because this was all new to him, and Mary Elizabeth, was much more timid and demure and mindful and cutesy. If you've seen that guy on TikTok, you know what I'm saying. So this kind of environment, this kind of life was very exciting to John, to say the least. Why the heck would he want to sit at home with his uptight wife and crying baby when he could be out having the time of his life romping around San Francisco with the wild and crazy Cordelia? Very, very tempting to a young man. And it turns out that Cordelia had a bit of a reputation around town. So, needless to say, everyone thought she was ratchet. Again, my words, not theirs. But, how dare a woman smoke, gamble, drink, and have sex? Ugh, disgusting, right? So, needless to say, when people started seeing John with Mrs. Botkin, rumors started to swirl, things started to happen, people started to talk, and it didn't take Mary Elizabeth long to find out about her husband's extracurricular activities. By this point in their marriage and in their lives, Mary had it. She expressed how unhappy she had been to John prior to finding out about the affair. So this slap in the face was just the straw that broke the camel's back. In 1896, Mary Elizabeth and Mary Jr. returned to Dover. That meant that John Dunning was now as free as Cordelia, which turned out to be not so good for him. Bailey Sarian, who does Murder Mystery Makeup Monday on YouTube, as well as the Dark History podcast, covered this case. And she compared John to a teenager on spring break. And I think that's the best way to sum up Dunning's spiral. Once again, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, everybody. Over the 3-year span that John and Cordelia carried on their relationship, Dunning developed a gambling and a drinking problem. At one point, he had dug himself pretty deep into debt because of gambling and really couldn't think of a way out. The solution he came up with was to borrow, air quotes, borrow money from his job to get him ahead again, and then he would pay the money back at some point. This idiot stole $4,000. $4,000 is a lot of money, even now, to steal from your place of employment, but that's $14,000 in the 1800s. Today, that would be more than $128,000. Can you even imagine trying to steal something like that from your job? So as you can imagine, with such a large amount of money missing, John was swiftly apprehended and was fired for embezzlement. Now, the series of events leading up to this point had John feeling like he had hit rock bottom. His wife and child left him. He had lost his job as a highly respected reporter and just barely avoided being arrested and going to prison. To make matters worse, his alcohol consumption was way out of hand, and drinking wasn't solving any of the problems that he was trying to drown away. Living such a fast lifestyle was starting to lose its appeal, and John knew that something had to change. In March of 1898, John miraculously was rehired by the Associated Press and was sent to leave San Francisco to cover the Spanish-American War, where he would go on to write about Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. This meant that he would have to move to Cuba, and this was the perfect opportunity for him to turn his life around. Prior to his departure, he sat Cordelia down and let her know that their relationship was over. John had every intention of proving himself as a reporter, getting his reputation back, and getting back his wife and his family. Cordelia did not take this well, and she was distraught. John's road to redemption would prove to be the best decision he ever made. Not only did he and Mary Elizabeth reconcile, but he would also go down in history for pulling survivors of the battleships that were sunk at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba on July 2nd, 1989, out of the water, saving multiple lives. Way to go, John. This guy just has a knack for saving sailors, I guess. Alas, this story does not have a happy ending. We've already heard about the tumultuous relationship between John and Mary Elizabeth, John and Cordelia, but we haven't gotten to the chocolate yet. On August 9th, 1898, Mary Elizabeth received a small package at her parents' house. That evening, the family enjoyed a well-prepared meal, and after supper, everyone sat on the veranda to beat the muggy summer heat. It's August in Delaware. Humidity. Awful. Sticky. Ugh. In attendance were Mr. and Mrs. Pennington, Mary Elizabeth's sister and brother-in-law, their son, and Mary Jr. Mary Elizabeth figured that this would be a good time to investigate what was inside of the package she received, and to her pleasant surprise, inside was an expensive-looking candy box containing a handkerchief, chocolate creams, and a note. The note read, "With love to yourself and baby, signed Mrs. C." Mary Elizabeth assumed that Mrs. C was a woman by the name of Laura Corbally, who was a friend she made while she was living in San Francisco. So, she received this gift from her friend and she decided, let's dig on in, right? Mrs. Dunning, her sister Ida Dean, and Ida's children all began eating the gift. They also shared the sweets with two neighbors who happened to be passing by, Miss Millington and Miss Bateman. And later that night, every person who ate a piece of candy became extremely ill, and they were cursed with abdominal pains and heavy vomiting. After days of excruciating pain and intense sickness, Mary Elizabeth Dunning and Ida Dean would sadly pass away. Both of their death certificates list the cause of death as arsenic poisoning sent by U.S. mail by parties unknown. Date of death, 8/12/1898. You see, everyone else who had ate the candy had only eaten maybe just like one piece. Mary and Ida indulged a little bit more than the others, which is why they were the only two to become so ill that they passed away from the poison. Now, who in the world would send poisonous candy to Mrs. Dunning? I'll give you 3 guesses, but you should only need one. You see, after John broke things off with Cordelia, she did not take things well, as I previously mentioned. She was distraught. And that's likely an understatement, to be honest, because keying someone's car after a breakup is dramatic. Attempted murder is next level, and it didn't take much time at all for Botkin to begin plotting her revenge against the newly reunited couple. I just mentioned that John was rehired by the Associated Press and made arrangements to leave the country in March of 1898. Mary Elizabeth was dead only 5 months later. These days, in the 2020s, a scorned lover is most likely to take to social media or texting to stir things up with their ex. Calling from a blocked number, having your girlfriends harass this chick. No, I'm not speaking from experience. I'm just saying. But none of this existed back in the 1800s. Not even in the late 1800s. But Cordelia was not going to let that stop her. Where there is a will, there is a way, apparently, because this woman began her revenge campaign by sending frequent anonymous letters to Elizabeth Dunning, each detailing distinct aspects of her husband's affair. These letters often suggested that Mary divorce John and be done with him, and this began to upset Mary. No longer able to stand the letters and read them, she asked her father to intercept them moving forward so that she didn't have to see them at all. When the mail was delivered, Mr. Pennington happily obliged and would collect and hide the letters from his daughter because they did continue to arrive. One day, Cordelia recalled a conversation that she had with John about his wife's extreme love of sweets, and that is when her plan to send poisonous chocolate was born. I'm going to jump forward just a little bit and take you back to right after Mary and Ida had passed away. By now, you and I know that Cordelia is the person responsible for sending the chocolates and ultimately killing the 2 women. But just days after the tragedy took place, the Pennington family was left with more questions than answers. When John Dunning received word of his wife's death, he went home to Dover as quickly as possible. Determined to get to the bottom of what happened to his daughters, Congressman Pennington had a light bulb moment and decided to compare the note that arrived with the candy to the stack of anonymous letters that Mary had been receiving over the last few months. To his amazement, the handwriting was a match, and Dunning confirmed that the letters had been sent from Cordelia. No time was wasted, and the Dover police were contacted immediately. The local police sent Detective B.J. McVeigh to San Francisco with the box of candy, handkerchief, and the note. The murder of a congressman's daughter was obviously a big deal, leading to San Francisco's chief of police taking charge personally. The San Francisco police instantly recognized the brown paper and pink satin bow that the chocolates were packaged in as being the signature wrapping that the George Haas confectionery used in all 4 of their locations. The women who worked at the counter of one of the stores remembered selling a half box of chocolate bonbons on July 31st to a short, stout, and frumpy woman. This transaction stood out in the clerks' minds, not only because of the way the physical description of the woman, but because the customer specifically requested that the box not be filled fully because she had other items that she wanted to add to it. Which, if you're coming to this hoity-toity fancy candy place, you're spending all this money, you want to get your money's worth, typically. But the customer insisted, no, just fill it halfway. I'm fine with that. After this discovery, more evidence began to piece itself together, and Cordelia was eventually arrested. Miss Botkin had been positively identified at the candy shop, San Francisco's City of Paris department store where she purchased the handkerchief, the pharmacy where she purchased the deadly arsenic, and even the post office where she mailed the package from. We got another idiot on our hands here, folks. Botkin's trial was not a straightforward one. The problem was that she had shipped the poisoned candy from California, but it had been received and killed someone in Delaware. This led to much arguing over jurisdiction and where ultimately Botkin should be tried. Cordelia ended up being tried in California, and on December 30th, 1898, Judge Cook found Cordelia Botkin guilty of 2 counts of murder in the first degree, and she was sentenced to life in prison on February 4th. One Sunday, after the sentencing had taken place, Judge Cook was out and about around town when he spotted Cordelia. To his astonishment, Cordelia was riding along in a streetcar all by herself, unaccompanied, and most importantly, not in prison. The judge launched an investigation into why this woman was not locked up in a cell where she belonged. And as it turns out, Cordelia was trading sexual favors for certain freedoms and creature comforts. And one more time, folks, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Like that was this woman's way of life. Unbelievable. After the Great San Francisco earthquake in 1906, Cordelia's current jail, the prison where she was being held, became too crowded, and she was transferred to San Quentin, which is a pretty rough place. During her final years, the people Cordelia cared about started to die off in rapid succession. Her father passed away in Healdsburg, California in 1900. Her husband, Welcome, died on May 2nd, 1904, of the same heart condition that would later claim her son the next year. And years of drinking finally caught up with John Preston Dunning, and he died in Philadelphia in April of 1907. Naturally, Cordelia became depressed. Her sorrow was so great that her health began to suffer. Whether she was sorry for killing Mary Elizabeth Dunning and her sister, or sorry because she was caught, sorry that, her family had all started to pass away, and here she is in prison, unable to grieve and attend funerals. We have no way of knowing for sure, right? On March 7th, 1910, Cordelia passed away in prison. Her death certificate lists the cause of death as softening of the brain due to melancholy. She was 56 years old at the time of her death and still an awful person. That's that, guys. That is the story of Cordelia Botkin and the Dover chocolate candy murders. There's a few different names to the crime, but this, again, is the first instance of murder being committed via USPS mail. It's a huge deal. Sadly, 2 women lost their lives. It's just a whirlwind, right? It's a wild time. So I don't think I need to say this, but if you ever receive candy in the mail, don't eat it unless you know who it's coming from or you know you're expecting it. Be careful out there tonight if you go out and enjoy trick-or-treating. I hope everyone stays safe. I hope kids get buttloads of candy, and I hope they enjoy all the candy they get. I hope no one gets toothbrushes or carrot sticks or whatever. I hope you all enjoy this holiday, and until we meet again, just because you thought nothing ever happened here, you thought wrong.